Infrastructure investment is vital for Africa's growth, but funding remains a challenge. How can private sector investment in infrastructure unlock the continent's sustainable development? Let's find out in the Blue Space.
I'm Vuyo Ntoi. I'm the Joint Managing Director of African Infrastructure Investment Managers.
My name is Jonathan Muga. I look after the infrastructure sector in Standard Bank within CIB.
Favorite city in Africa?
Malindi, that's on the coast of Kenya, the best beaches.
Have to be Cape Town, although I live there.
Analog or digital?
Analog.
Why analog?
I'm old school.
You're old school.
Welcome back to the Blue Space, brought to you by Standard Bank Corporate and Investment Banking. I'm Joanne Joseph, and in this episode, we'll explore how private sector investment in infrastructure can unlock Africa's sustainable development. Joining me for this conversation in the Blue Space studio are Jonathan Muga, Global Head of Infrastructure at Standard Bank CIB, and Vuyo Ntoi, Co-Managing Director at African Infrastructure Investment Managers. Gentlemen, welcome to the Blue Space. Lovely to have you with us today. Also in this episode, we'll get some perspective from Mike Salawou, Director of Infrastructure, Cities and Urban Development at the African Development Bank. The AFDB is a key infrastructure development partner on the continent, and I spoke to Mike earlier to get his view on this topic. But Jonathan, I'm going to kick off with you for the moment. What does Africa need to do right now to develop the infrastructure needed to drive the continent forward?
Thank you, Joanne. I would say that there are three things that Africa needs to do differently. The first one is how they bring projects into the market for investment. They need to prioritize projects, plan them well, so that they are able to deliver those projects to investors. The second thing is the rules of the game need to be clear. They need to be clear and predictable. What am I talking about? It's the regulatory environment, the framework, how they procure projects. And lastly, they need to bring a steady pipeline of projects, because for investors, it's important for them to understand that they can allocate large amounts of capital rather than drip feeding and waiting for projects to come, and some of them don't reach financial close.
So in other words, they need a number of projects to invest in at the same time.
Yes.
All right, that's interesting indeed. Now, from a private capital point of view, some international investors are deterred by perceptions of higher risk in African countries. Here's what Mike Salawou of the African Development Bank had to say about these perceptions.
Perception of risk is one of the key challenges we are facing in Africa, and we pay high premium for that. That means perception of the risk, in our perspective, is far away from the reality on the ground. Because we know the continent, we operate in all the 54 African countries. We know the risk in South Africa. It's not the same as in Senegal. Neither is the risk in Kenya. It's the same as Niger or Morocco. So this reality check is very important. And quite often we see that people don't really go to look at the data that are speaking to these things. For instance, the Moody's Analytic. That's not ADB, it's Moody's. They produce a report compiling the data for the last 10 years on the default rate on infrastructure-led debt on the continent of Africa compared to Europe, Latin America, and Asia. It turns out that Africa has the least default rate on infrastructure-led debt, compared to the other continent, and which goes counter to what we're actually listening to about the perception of risk. But that's the strong data, and we believe that we want to be telling those narratives more and more to show the data that perception is one thing, but in reality is another thing.
Well, that was Mike Salawou, Director of Infrastructure, Cities and Urban Development at the African Development Bank. Vuyo, you heard what Mike had to say there. What are your thoughts? Do you think this is a fair perception of Africa?
Yeah, no, the perception is unfair. And indeed, the experience is that default rates on African projects are much lower than the global average, which speaks to the fact that African projects are less risky than their global counterparts. However, this is a top level view. And if you look down on the ground, the truth is that projects on the continent tend to be a lot more structured from a contractual perspective with various protections that don't apply to projects around the world. I think the dearth of new projects and the slow pipeline have meant that there's been very little learning, and as a result, the mitigants that applied to projects about 20 years ago still persist. So what we need is more projects, evolution, so that the sort of risk mitigants that include the likes of government guarantees, etc., hopefully fall away as there's more learning and experience on projects in the continent.
And that makes a lot of sense. Jonathan, many African governments also expressing a desire to attract private capital, but of course they lack the necessary regulatory frameworks. How does Standard Bank work with African governments to create the kind of policy environment that can foster the private investment we so need in our infrastructure projects?
Yeah, so thanks, Joanne. I think it's important to give a little bit of context. So until now, most of the projects that have been done in the continent have been done by governments, sovereigns, on their own balance sheet, which means they've borrowed and executed. Now, with some of the challenges that governments have with a high debt burden, what's happened is they have to look for other ways to do projects. And this is where new regulatory frameworks, for example, the PPP framework, becomes important, where you can attract capital from the private sector. However, the reality is that they're still in their nascent stages. And what we as Standard Bank are doing is, one, we are engaging with the public sector. We've got specialists within the bank who focus on engaging with sovereigns to understand what their priorities are and where we can support with capacity building. Sometimes we do workshops for them. And other institutions, other like development finance institutions, multilaterals, also play their role in building capacity. But lastly, one way to attract more private capital is to do pathfinder projects. Identify a couple of projects, see them through the cycle all the way to financial close so that the sovereigns can build the muscle. And then you can then to build more and more programs, which provides the steady pipeline that I was talking about earlier.
Right. Well, as a development finance institution, the African Development Bank takes a different approach. Earlier, I asked Mike Salawou how the AFDB seeks to attract private partners. Here are his comments.
What we're trying to do is to de-risk projects. So it's very important that we de-risk projects so that we can attract funding. So what we do is early stage, where nobody wants to actually intervene because you have a project concept. It's too risky, you don't know what it is. So we can put some early risk capital on those projects, what we call project preparation capital, to de-risk the project, bring them to bankability, and then after that, be able to allocate the risk to the best practice, able to manage those risks, and then have the mitigant, the guarantee here and there to actually manage those risks. So that's the way we look at it, so that we can de-risk those projects to attract private sector investment. And we believe that this is very important. So if you do that, showing the data, we believe that we can change the narrative on the perception of risk because it's costing too much for African countries to attract the private sector. But we are seeing a change in that perception due to the fact that data are actually showing something different.
Okay, some very interesting comments there taking the conversation forward, Vuyo. And we know that public-private partnerships are often cited as a kind of key mechanism for financing infrastructure in Africa. But what does it take for PPPs to succeed within the African context?
I think what's required is the same for PPPs throughout the world, and that's contractual compliance. PPPs aren't a panacea. They are a mechanism whereby government can undertake very large capex projects on an off-balance sheet basis, i.e. Government doesn't have to pay for the actual construction of the project. But beyond that, what has to happen is government needs to stick to its obligations in terms of paying where government is required to pay, or enabling end users to pay for the project so that investors such as ourselves are protected. So in a sense, I think contractual compliance, a regulatory framework that's understandable and predictable is required in order to get the flywheel on PPPs going. And furthermore, I think something that I've highlighted alongside Jonathan is the fact that we need to get lots more projects going. Lots more projects going. Contractual compliance leads to an environment where there's a great deal of partnership between governments and the private sector more generally.
Well, the AFDB's 10-year strategy is pinned to what it calls the high fives, which are to light up and power Africa, feed Africa, industrialize Africa, integrate Africa, and improve the quality of life for the people of Africa. Well, Vuyo, how do we make sure that the projects in which we invest create a positive social and environmental impact?
Okay, thanks for that, Joanne. I'll first of all start with government and the license they have as the initiators of these PPP projects in setting the requirements for social and economic development around the projects that they initiate. I think in the case of South Africa, for instance, an example is the renewable energy process, where a number of social and economic development requirements were established around the projects that were initiated. And as a result of that, there were kind of multiple initiatives with millions of rands being spent on these social initiatives. I do think as well, when you do get a flywheel of projects happening, what you do is you attract the best of breed investment managers and project developers. And as a result of that, these entities tend to have kind of world-class social and economic development measures for themselves beyond government requirements. And as a result, you tend to find projects that positively affect the communities in which they're located.
Any closing thoughts from you, Jonathan?
Yeah, thanks, Joanne. I think the continent finds itself in a very unique phase of development because of the infrastructure gap and underinvestment. Anything that the continent does, particularly if it's integrated with the community, is going to improve the livelihoods of its people. And the social impact is going to be very significant. And if you look at that alongside protecting our environment, it's going to be giving a livelihood and a sustained economic development for the continent.
Well, plenty to talk about as always, but we'll leave it there for today. Our thanks again to Jonathan Muga, Global Head of Infrastructure at Standard Bank CIB, Vuyo Ntoi, Co-Managing Director at African Infrastructure Investment Managers, and Mike Salawou, Director of Infrastructure, Cities and Urban Development at the African Development Bank. Gentlemen, thank you so much for sharing your insights today. Great talking to you. And from me, Joanne Joseph, and the rest of the Blue Space team, that's all for now. Take care. Bye-bye.
Visit www.standardbank.com/bluespace to find out more about the Blue Space.